AI is often sold as a way to increase work productivity, either by allowing an individual worker to do as much as an entire team, or as a way to get work done without any human at all through automation. It's been a few years since AI productivity has been in use in industry, so let's check in and see how things are doing. What we'll find is that the productivity metric we choose to measure will have a large impact on how individuals behave and the output that we get. This is the Talk to Me PDD podcast, where we talk all things knowledge work, tech and society, leadership, and today one of my favorites, productivity. I'm your host, PDD. Please like and subscribe, support the show, check me out on all the platforms, and don't sleep on the newsletter. Links are in the show notes. So without further ado, this is episode 61, Performative Productivity and AI. So what is productivity? Let's kind of take a step back here before we get into the details of knowledge work in AI. A simple way to think about it is just the output generated with a given set of resources. And resources are either capital or labor. So with capital, you have some machines, you have some goods, maybe some ingredients if you're making a recipe, or components that go into building something or creating something. And then you have the labor, the people that are working on it, doing that transformation. And this may be sort of just generic labor, or it may require particular skills to execute the process. So those are your resources, capital and labor. And then there may be various different processes that can use those resources to generate the output that you're looking to produce. That's the process, and the process is all often considered a technology. So you might have a technological advance which will offer you a new process and maybe allow you to use your inputs differently or the same inputs to create more output than a previous process could. Um, so it could be an invention or a new machine that allows you to use a different process, or it could be an actual process improvement itself with the same existing sort of machine and skill technologies that you have today. Some processes are going to produce more with the same input as another process would do with that same input. And some processes use different ratios of resources. So, for example, just kind of at the highest level, you might have different ratios of labor and capital to create the same output. And it's a different ratio with different processes. So, in that case, the price of the resources, um, whether it's labor or capital, or within those categories, some specific details, if there are different prices, that may dictate the process that's preferable, and that could change over time as prices change. Um, as an aside, this is sort of an interesting thing to consider with automation of human labor with AI, and as the price for one of those resources, let's say human labor, is higher than AI to do the same work, consider, assuming they're comparable, um, that's going to encourage organizations to choose automation. But if that changes, which it could for a variety of reasons, then those same organizations might choose to use a different process and less automation. So there you go. We're grounded a little bit in sort of this classical view of productivity and how we consider that. Um, that's all good for industrial type production, so factories, manufacturing, farming. It's usually a pretty straightforward way to measure the process, the various inputs that you have going in between capital and labor, the different types of resources, and the outputs you get. Where it gets a little more tricky, or a lot more tricky, in my opinion, is with knowledge work. So um, that's what more and more industry is shifting to, creating ideas, working with tech, working in science and other research areas, or creative outputs. So, how do you map an idea or information that you're creating in the same way that you do kind of the inputting productivity process for running a factory or running a farm? They're pretty different. If I go for a walk in the woods and I get a world changing idea while I'm on that walk versus my colleague who's spending 60 hours in meetings that week, who's really more productive, right? Is it sort of the activity that you're doing or the actual output? And if the valuable output is knowledge based, it can be tricky to measure it in the same way or the same constrained processes, because we don't generate ideas and knowledge the same way that we do some of these kind of more traditional industrial style processes. So, what have a lot of people done? A lot of times in knowledge work, organizations and people will use proxy measures, so things that are easier to measure, um, and use that as a stand-in for trying to actually measure the harder piece of how these ideas and how this knowledge creation comes about. You want more on this? Cal Newport's done a ton on it. Definitely influenced me, so go and check that out more if you want to deep dive into that. Um, a lot of it is focusing on visible activity. So things that people can see you doing, showing that you're busy, that you're in a meeting, that you're sending email. Now that so much of knowledge work is in the digital space, you can measure a lot of these things because you're creating data with these activities. So it's both visible in the sense that people can see your activity and also that there's a digital record and data that can track it. And it's not necessarily a terrible idea, right? If somebody is having good conversations, if they're showing up at meetings and contributing, that might likely mean that they're creating valuable output. Um, but it's a correlation, not necessarily a causation, and there's not a direct um, connection that I've somebody is showing more visible activity, they're necessarily generating more productive output in the world of knowledge work. In fact, it might be the opposite. If you're spending your entire week in meetings, you might not have time to think or go and execute on some of your ideas or do some deep focused work. Um, so, what are the things that people tend to measure in knowledge work, these visible activities? I mentioned it, meetings, communications of all different types. So, that could be emails, it could be different types of chat messages. Maybe if you're using some kind of posting board, it could be there. If you're in software development, it could be your code check ins showing that activity. Could be usage of particular tools that are required to get your job done. If you're in some sort of support scenario, it's often tickets handled, things like that. So, depending on what the purpose and role you're in, there might be a strong correlation between how much activity you have here, or there might be a weaker correlation. There's usually some, but how much is really dependent on the role. So going back to the kind of the customer support scenario and handling tickets, if you're sort of a frontline person, it might very well be a great measure of your productivity, how many support tickets you handle, how you're resolving them. That's essentially your job, right? Now, where it can be more confusing is, let's say you have a more senior support person who's not taking as many support cases or sort of not the first point of contact. So if you're just measuring on how many tickets they handled, it's going to look like they're less productive than the person who's on the front line. But this might be the only person who can solve really complicated issues that nobody else can solve. So you have to consider what you're going to measure, what that person's role is, and it probably doesn't make sense to measure or think about their productivity in the same way you do as somebody who's on the front line, who's just moving through as much as they can. Um, but is not going to be able to solve some of the trickier issues that more senior person can do. So none of this is new. It's not like this came about with generative AI and large language models, um, but because this trend has been there, and one of the things that AI can do is it can measure things faster. Um, and kind of keep track of many different things. And it can do activities a lot of times faster than people can do, or at a scale greater than what an individual can do. So if you are focused on these visual activities as how you're going to measure productivity, and then you can have an AI tool that can do more of those, then the conclusion would be that, okay, AI is going to make me more productive. And we'll see that may or may not be the case. It can definitely allow you to do more of those visible activities or process more of that information. But does that ultimately lead to a more productive output? I think that's not always the case. Um, now, um, one of the things to consider is that we've had this trend and culture of valuing visible activity and knowledge work as productivity. And organizations will often build systems around that where they will reward people based on their performative productivity in particular areas. And again, going back to the support scenario, this might be appropriate. You might want to award somebody who's at the front line of customer support more and recognize them if they handle a certain amount of tasks, and that's very visible. But then how do you think about doing the same thing for somebody who's more senior, who can some of these really complex issues, and maybe there's a important customer or a contract associated with that. um, so thinking about what's the appropriate system for the appropriate role, because people tend to operate to their own advantage in these systems. So if you were to reward all of your support people the same purely by the number of incidents that they handled, then that might encourage a real senior person who's the only one that can solve these real tricky issues to go and just take easy frontline cases so that they can maximize how they show up, to be rewarded in the system, which is not a beneficial output for the business. And if the business is ultimate goal and their sort of key performance indicator and metrics is to be able to support their entire customer base and to resolve all of these issues, and then to be a part of an organization that's making a product successful, then that type of system is not going to lead to the best output and the best productivity for the organization. Um, One of the things specifically with AI where we saw this show up recently is in the concept of token maxing, which came as a trend and departed fairly quickly, but that was using as much AI as possible and as many tokens or interactions with AI systems as possible. And if that's the system that you're in, it's fairly straightforward to maximize how you're rewarded in that. And if there's a leaderboard of how many tokens people are using, and that's the system of reward, it doesn't necessarily matter if that helps you get your tasks done or helps you accomplish what the organization sees as a productive output. If that's the system of reward that you're put in, there are many ways that you can change your behavior to maximize the benefit for you, which may not benefit the organization. And in the case of token maxing, where it happened right around the same times as the costs to use tokens in AI started going up. So essentially rewarding people for spending additional money that may or may not be necessary in a given situation. So probably not the best system of reward to have there. Um, some of the things that are also interesting about the way that we look at productivity in knowledge work and what's possible with AI now, is that it's more possible to create environments of surveillance or worker surveillance, where this has happened in a lot of different types of roles in labor over the years. Um, for those of us in knowledge work, I think it's not something that we've seen directly that much. We more think about sort of a quote unquote boss who has to tell workers what to do because they're going to just lay about and do nothing if they're not forced to do work. That's not really the sort of the culture of work in most knowledge work organizations. Um, and some of it was probably a technical challenge. It was difficult to measure some of these interactions. And if we go back to that real measure of productivity, they may not even be the right things to measure. But now that there's so many more of these data points, trying to um, kind of encourage organizations and people to go through an evolution and a change of how they work and adopting AI, that being an incentive as well as sort of just the productivity outputs. And now having all of these different ways to measure activity, AI use, tool use, things like that. Um, that provides much more of an opportunity to have systems of surveillance and for technology companies to build that sort of data collection and tracking and aggregation into their tools. I think it's fair to say people generally don't like being surveilled and judged this way at work, especially if you're in a knowledge work role where it's not something like that frontline support engineer, but more like a creative writer or a thought leader or something like that, where ultimately doesn't really matter how you get to the ideas and the output that you create. It's the impact that they have. Um, so I think that can actually stifle creativity, and it's something that organizations should consider carefully. It's also something that I think can encourage workers to try and sabotage or game the system if they feel like they're being put in kind of an unjust situation, or if they're being blindly rewarded for a certain type of behavior, like we saw in token maxing. Um, there is some incentive there either to uh, try and hurt the system that you're in if you don't agree with it, or more selfishly just to game the system to use it in a way that's going to benefit you. Um, so what do you do if you're a knowledge worker? You find yourself in an environment like this or a system that is incentivizing this performative activity over what you might see as the ultimate goal of your role, or to help your organization with um, productive output and really impactful work versus activity. Um, I think, as always, it's where we have to navigate a little bit of both. If you're in a system that expects certain behaviors and certain activities, you're probably going to be swimming upstream if you try and totally ignore those things. Maybe you're in a position where you can get away with it. Probably most people aren't. So some participation in that and understanding that even if it doesn't necessarily directly translate in the way that you think it does, it's sort of a requirement of the environment that you're in, and hopefully you can influence change there. But then even while you're doing that, keeping sight of what's actually important, what you see is delivering the most impact to your organization, and understanding how you can continue to land that work, even while you're, maybe required to do some sort of performative activity to satisfy the system that you're in. I mean, I think all roles have that some sort of imperfection and some sort of organizational compliance that you're going to need to do. So just look at it that way, as sort of the nature of the beast in an organizational life. Ultimately, AI is a tool. How we use it matters. If we use it to amplify or scale or increase performative activity that doesn't translate into real productivity, then we're not going to get any more productivity. We may, in fact, get less. But if we have ways that we can use AI as a tool that are going to directly contribute to high impact work, and allow us to um, access more creativity, more information, to be able to analyze data and things of that nature, then it absolutely can lead to more productive impact and output for businesses. And I think businesses are starting to realize that what they measure matters, and it's not just measuring how many emails that an AI tool can allow each person to get through, or meeting summaries and trying to translate into hours saved and that sort of thing, but ultimately tying it to the business goals that that organization or that company cares about, and making sure that it's driving a positive change there, and they're getting the appropriate return on investment for the AI tools. So that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this piece on productivity, performative, and real, and how AI factors into that. So again, please like and subscribe the show. Follow me on all the different platforms. Check out the newsletter. Check out my website, peterdempseywrites.com. And good luck in your AI and productivity journey. Thanks.